My name is Isabella Scott. I'm 32 years old, and I just discovered that my parents gave away my $550,000 collection of vintage family engagement rings to my younger sister because she's getting married first, completely ignoring the fact that these priceless heirlooms were explicitly willed to me as the eldest daughter and had been under my careful guardianship for over a decade. What my family didn't know was that their cruel betrayal and theft of 5 generations of Scott family legacy was about to trigger the most comprehensive legal revenge in inheritance law history, one that would cost them far more than they could have ever imagined and restore justice to a family tradition they had so callously destroyed. The moment I walked into my childhood bedroom to check on the climate-controlled jewelry safe where I had been preserving our family's most precious heirlooms for the past 12 years, I felt my world collapse around me. The safe stood empty, its velvet-lined compartments that had once housed centuries of love stories and family history, now containing nothing but vacant spaces where each irreplaceable ring had been meticulously stored and catalogued. This wasn't just a collection of expensive jewelry. This was the physical embodiment of 5 generations of Scott women who had worn these rings during the most important moments of their lives. Each piece represented a love story, a historical era, and a sacred trust that had been passed down through our family for over 150 years. I had been the designated guardian of these treasures since my grandmother's death when I was 20, and I had treated this responsibility with the reverence and dedication it deserved. The crown jewel of our collection was my great-great-grandmother Victoria's 1887 Victorian engagement ring, featuring a 5-carat old European-cut diamond, surrounded by sapphires in an elaborate 18-carat gold setting that had been handcrafted by London's most prestigious jewelers. This ring alone was valued at $150,000, but its historical and sentimental value was absolutely priceless. Then there was my great-grandmother Eleanor's Art Deco masterpiece from 1923, and stunning geometric design featuring a 3-carat Asher-cut diamond flanked by emeralds and intricate platinum millgrain work that perfectly captured the glamour and innovation of the Jazz Age. This ring had been appraised at $95,000 and was considered museum quality by experts in vintage jewelry. My grandmother Catherine's 1952 retro-style ring showcased a 2.5-carat round brilliant diamond in a distinctive yellow-gold mounting with ruby accents that reflected the post-war optimism and bold design aesthetic of the early 1950s. Valued at $75,000, this ring had been worn through 63 years of marriage before being passed to my care. The collection also included my mother's original engagement ring from 1985, a classic solitaire featuring a 2-carat princess-cut diamond in a simple platinum setting that had cost my father 3 months' salary, but represented decades of love and commitment. Even this more contemporary piece was worth $45,000 due to the exceptional quality of the diamond and the craftsmanship of the setting. Beyond these major pieces, the collection included several other rings that had belonged to various Scott women throughout our family's history. A 1940s wartime ring featuring a modest but beautifully cut diamond that had been given during uncertain times, a 1960s modern design that reflected the changing aesthetics of that decade, and even a delicate Edwardian piece from 1905 that had been worn by a great-aunt whose love story had become family legend. Each ring had been professionally cleaned, appraised, and stored in museum-quality conditions within the temperature and humidity-controlled safe that I had installed in my childhood bedroom specifically for their protection. I had detailed documentation for every piece, including professional appraisals, historical provenance records, photographs tracking their condition over time, and insurance policies that covered their full replacement value. More than their monetary worth, these rings represented an unbroken chain of Scott women who had been loved, cherished, and committed to building families and legacies that would endure for generations. Wearing these rings wasn't just about displaying beautiful jewelry. It was about connecting to the strength, love, and wisdom of the women who had come before us. I had always understood that someday, when I found the right person to marry, I would choose one of these rings to wear as my own engagement ring, continuing the family tradition while preserving the collection for future generations. The thought of wearing my great-great-grandmother Victoria's ring, feeling connected to her love story while beginning my own, had been one of my most cherished dreams since childhood. Standing in that empty safe, staring at the vacant spaces where each precious ring had been stored, I felt like I was looking at graves that had been robbed. 5 generations of love, commitment, and family history had vanished, leaving nothing but empty velvet compartments. and the crushing realization that someone I trusted had destroyed something sacred and irreplaceable. My hands were trembling as I called my mother, desperately hoping that there had been some terrible misunderstanding, that maybe the rings had been moved for insurance purposes or professional cleaning, that this wasn't the devastating betrayal it appeared to be. The phone rang 3 times before Margaret Scott's familiar voice answered with a tone that immediately told me my worst fears were about to be confirmed. "Hello, Isabella," my mother said, her voice carrying a defensive edge that suggested she already knew why I was calling and was prepared for confrontation rather than explanation. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, as I tried to maintain composure while my world crumbled around me. "The jewelry safe is empty. All of the engagement rings are gone. Do you know what happened to them?" The pause that followed was long enough to confirm that my mother not only knew exactly what had happened to the rings, but had been directly involved in their disappearance. When she finally responded, her voice had shifted from defensive to almost aggressive, as if I was being unreasonable by asking about the location of family heirlooms that had been under my guardianship for over a decade. "Oh, that," Margaret said dismissively, as if the disappearance of $550,000 worth of family treasures was a minor detail hardly worth discussing. "We gave them to Chloe. She's getting engaged, and she needs beautiful rings for her wedding. It only makes sense that the rings should go to the daughter who's actually getting married." The casual way my mother admitted to giving away 5 generations of Scott family heritage was so shocking that I initially couldn't process what she was telling me. She was talking about the theft of irreplaceable family heirlooms as if she was discussing lending Chloe a dress or borrowing a book. "You gave them to Chloe?" I repeated, still not believing what I was hearing. "Mom, those rings were willed to me specifically. Grandmother's will explicitly states that the collection goes to the eldest daughter. They were my responsibility to preserve and eventually pass down to the next generation." "Isabella, don't be so dramatic about this," Margaret replied, her tone becoming more irritated as she realized I wasn't going to simply accept their decision and move on. "Chloe is getting married in 6 months. She deserves to have beautiful family rings for her engagement and wedding. You've had those rings locked away for 12 years without using them. What's the point of having beautiful jewelry if no one ever wears it?" The fundamental misunderstanding of what it meant to be a guardian of family treasures was breathtaking. My mother was treating centuries of Scott family history like costume jewelry that was being wasted by not being worn to parties, completely ignoring the sacred trust that had been placed in my care and the legal documents that established my ownership of the collection. "Mom, I wasn't hoarding those rings," I explained, trying to help her understand the magnitude of what she and my father had done. "I was preserving them for future generations, just like grandmother asked me to do. The collection was supposed to stay intact until I had children of my own to pass it down to." "Well, maybe if you had focused more on finding a husband instead of focusing on your career, you would have been the one getting married first," Margaret said, her voice becoming cruel in a way I had never heard before. "Chloe found love and is ready to start a family. She deserves to have the family rings because she's the one who appreciates what they represent." "Arthur, have you ever had someone you trusted completely rewrite history to justify betraying you?" That's exactly what I experienced as my mother transformed my dedication to preserving family treasures into selfishness and my career success into a character flaw that somehow disqualified me from my inheritance. "This isn't about who gets married first," I said, my voice rising with emotion I could no longer contain. "This is about respecting grandmother's wishes and maintaining the family tradition she established. Those rings weren't meant to be given to whoever happened to get engaged first. They were meant to be preserved by the designated guardian until the right time came to pass them down properly." "The right time has come," Margaret replied firmly, clearly not interested in discussing the legal or moral problems with their decision. "Chloe is in love, she's getting married, and she will take wonderful care of the rings. You're 32 years old, Isabella. If you haven't found someone to marry by now, maybe it's time to accept that these rings are better off with someone who will actually use them." The cruel suggestion that my single status at 32 somehow disqualified me from my legal inheritance was devastating, but it was also revealing about how my parents viewed my life choices and achievements. They were treating my career success and financial independence as failures that made me unworthy of family treasures. "Where is Chloe now?" I asked, hoping that maybe I could reason with my sister directly and help her understand that accepting stolen family heirlooms wasn't appropriate regardless of her engagement status. "She's at her apartment with David, planning their engagement party," Margaret said proudly, as if Chloe's 6-month relationship was more meaningful than the century and a half of Scott family tradition that had just been destroyed. They're so excited about the rings, and Chloe looks absolutely beautiful wearing great-grandmother Victoria's ring. It's perfect on her, like it was meant to be hers. The image of Chloe wearing our great-great-grandmother's irreplaceable Victorian ring while planning a party to celebrate her whirlwind engagement was heartbreaking, but it was also infuriating. She was treating a museum-quality historical artifact like a fashion accessory while my parents praised her for appreciating what the ring represented. "Mom, I want to talk to Dad about this," I said, hoping that maybe my father would be more reasonable about the legal and ethical problems with giving away my inheritance without consulting me or respecting the terms of my grandmother's will. "Your father completely agrees with this decision," Margaret replied, before I could even finish asking to speak with him. "He thinks the ring should go to the daughter who values family and marriage over career ambitions. You made your choices, Isabella, and now you have to live with the consequences." The conversation ended with my mother hanging up on me after making it clear that their decision was final and that my concerns about legal ownership, family tradition, and proper inheritance procedures were irrelevant compared to Chloe's engagement excitement and their approval of her life choices. As I stood in my childhood bedroom staring at the empty safe that had once housed our family's most precious treasures, I realized that this wasn't just theft. It was a calculated punishment for my career success and my refusal to conform to their timeline for marriage and family. But what my parents didn't understand was that my legal expertise as a contract attorney had given me knowledge about inheritance law and property rights that would make their crime far more expensive than they had ever imagined possible. The devastation I felt after discovering that my family had stolen my inheritance was nothing compared to the emotional trauma of learning about the depth of their betrayal and the cruel reasoning behind their decision to punish me for my life choices while rewarding Chloe for her impulsive engagement to someone she barely knew. But as I researched the historical significance and legal ownership of our family's ring collection, I began to understand that what had been taken from me represented far more than expensive jewelry. It was the physical embodiment of 5 generations of Scott women who had built legacies through love, commitment, and careful preservation of family traditions. The Scott family engagement ring collection had begun with my great-great-grandmother Victoria Scott, who had received her extraordinary Victorian ring in 1887 when she became engaged to my great-great-grandfather Charles during the height of London's Victorian jewelry renaissance. Victoria had been the daughter of a successful textile merchant who had commissioned the ring from Gerard & Co., the same prestigious jewelers who created pieces for the British royal family. The ring itself was a masterpiece of Victorian craftsmanship, featuring a 5-carat-old European-cut diamond that had been selected for its exceptional clarity and brilliance. The diamond was surrounded by 12 perfectly matched sapphires in a setting that incorporated intricate millgrain work, delicate filigree, and hand-engraved details that required months of work by master craftsmen. The 18-carat gold mounting was designed in the elaborate Victorian style that emphasized both luxury and romantic symbolism. But beyond its monetary value, Victoria's ring represented the beginning of a family tradition that would span 5 generations of Scott women. Victoria had worn the ring through 43 years of marriage, and when she passed it to her daughter Eleanor in 1923, she had established the precedent that the Scott family engagement rings would be preserved and passed down through the female line as symbols of enduring love and family continuity. Eleanor Scott had added her own Art Deco masterpiece to the collection when she became engaged in 1923 to my great-grandfather William, a successful architect who had commissioned a ring that perfectly captured the geometric innovation and bold aesthetic of the Jazz Age. The ring featured a 3-carat Asher-cut diamond flanked by emeralds in a platinum setting that incorporated the clean lines and geometric patterns that defined Art Deco jewelry design. Eleanor's ring had been created by Tiffany & Co. during their most creative period, and it represented not just personal love but also the cultural optimism and artistic innovation of the 1920s. When Eleanor passed the growing collection to her daughter Catherine in 1952, she had established the tradition that each generation would add their own ring while preserving all previous rings for future generations. My grandmother Catherine had chosen a retro-style ring in 1952 that reflected the post-war optimism and distinctive design aesthetic of the early 1950s. Her ring featured a 2.5-carat round brilliant diamond in a yellow-gold mounting with ruby accents that created a bold, confident look that perfectly suited Catherine's personality and the cultural moment when women were redefining their roles in society. Catherine had been the most intentional guardian of the collection, recognizing that these rings represented not just personal memories, but also historical artifacts that documented the evolution of jewelry design and women's roles throughout American history. She had been the first to have the rings professionally appraised and insured, and she had created detailed documentation of their provenance and significance. When my mother Margaret became engaged to my father Robert in 1985, she had added a contemporary solitaire to the collection, a classic 2-carat princess-cut diamond in a simple platinum setting that represented the clean, modern aesthetic of the 1980s. While less historically significant than the older rings, my mother's ring still represented the continuation of Scott family tradition and the evolution of engagement ring styles through different decades. My grandmother Catherine had lived until I was 20, and during my teenage years, she had spent countless hours teaching me about each ring in the collection, their historical context, their artistic significance, and their role in our family's story. She had been intentional about preparing me to be the next guardian of the collection, understanding that preservation of family treasures requires knowledge, dedication, and respect for their historical importance. Isabella, my grandmother had told me during one of our many conversations about the rings, these aren't just pretty jewelry pieces. They're historical documents that tell the story of our family and the times they lived through. Each ring represents a woman who was loved enough to receive something beautiful and precious, and who loved her family enough to preserve that beauty for future generations. Catherine had been specific about her wishes for the collection's future. Her will, which I had read multiple times over the years, explicitly stated that the engagement ring collection should pass to Isabella Scott, my eldest granddaughter, with the understanding that she will preserve the collection and ensure its continuation for future generations of Scott women. The legal language had been carefully crafted by my grandmother's attorney to prevent exactly the kind of arbitrary redistribution that my parents had just attempted. The rings weren't meant to be given to whoever got married first. They were meant to be preserved by the designated guardian until appropriate times for their use and eventual passing to the next generation. Under my guardianship, the collection had been maintained in perfect condition for over 12 years. I had invested in a climate-controlled safe, professional cleaning and maintenance, updated insurance policies, and detailed documentation that tracked the condition and provenance of each piece. I had treated this responsibility with the seriousness it deserved, understanding that I was temporarily caring for treasures that belonged to future generations of Scott women. My expertise as a contract attorney had also helped me understand the legal implications of my guardianship. These rings weren't just family heirlooms. They were valuable property that had been specifically bequeathed to me through a legally binding will. My parents had no legal authority to redistribute my inheritance, regardless of their opinions about my life choices or their preferences for which daughter should benefit from family treasures. But the emotional significance of the rings went far beyond their legal or monetary value. Each piece represented a love story that had inspired me throughout my life, showing me what it looked like when people committed to building something lasting together. I had grown up imagining the day when I would wear one of these rings as my own engagement ring, feeling connected to the generations of strong Scott women who had worn them before me. The thought of my great-great-grandmother Victoria wearing her ring through decades of marriage, raising children, building a family legacy, and eventually passing that ring to her daughter had been a source of inspiration during difficult times in my own life. These rings represented not just romantic love, but also the kind of enduring commitment and family dedication that I hoped to achieve in my own relationships. Standing in my empty safe, I realized that my parents had stolen more than just expensive jewelry. They had stolen my connection to 5 generations of Scott women who had trusted me to preserve their legacy. They had broken a chain of family tradition that had endured for over 150 years, and they had done it to punish me for my career success, and to reward Chloe for conforming to their expectations about marriage and family timing. But as I began researching the legal options available to victims of inheritance theft, I discovered that my expertise as a contract attorney had given me knowledge about property law and estate litigation that would make my family's crime far more expensive than they had ever imagined. The rings they had so casually given away were about to become the center of a legal battle that would restore not just the physical collection, but also the justice and accountability that my grandmother's wishes deserved. Have you ever had family members steal something sacred from you while treating their theft as a favor to someone they favored more? That's exactly what I experienced, but it was also exactly what would make their eventual legal consequences so comprehensive and devastating. The confrontation with my parents about their theft of my inheritance took place the following Sunday, during what had been planned as a pleasant family dinner to celebrate Chloe's engagement and wedding plans. I had spent the week researching legal options and gathering documentation that proved my ownership of the ring collection, and I arrived at my parents' house prepared for a discussion about returning my property and acknowledging their mistake. What I found instead was a family celebration where my parents and Chloe were treating the stolen rings as wedding accessories, while dismissing my legal rights and emotional devastation as unreasonable selfishness that was threatening to ruin Chloe's happiness. The cruelty of their attitude was matched only by their complete ignorance about the legal consequences they were about to face. I walked into my parents' dining room to find Chloe wearing our great-great-grandmother Victoria's $150,000 Victorian ring while discussing wedding plans with our parents, who were praising her for finally bringing the family rings back to life after years of my selfish hoarding. The casual way they were treating a museum-quality historical artifact as party jewelry was heartbreaking, but it was also legally significant evidence of their knowing theft of valuable property. "Chloe," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the rage I felt at seeing our family's most precious heirloom being worn so casually. "We need to talk about the rings. Those weren't Mom and Dad's to give away. They were specifically willed to me, and I need them back." Chloe looked up from her wedding planning materials with an expression of annoyance rather than understanding, clearly viewing my concerns about legal ownership as an inconvenient interruption to her engagement celebration. "Isabella, don't be like this," she said dismissively. "I'm getting married, and I need beautiful rings for my wedding. These rings are perfect, and they look amazing on me. Why can't you just be happy for me?" The assumption that my legal ownership of family heirlooms was less important than her wedding aesthetic preferences was shocking, but it was also revealing about how little Chloe understood about inheritance law or the significance of what she was wearing. She was treating centuries of Scott family tradition like costume jewelry that existed for her personal enjoyment. "Chloe, I am happy for you," I explained, trying to help her understand the distinction between celebrating her engagement and accepting stolen property. "But these rings aren't wedding accessories. They're family heirlooms that were specifically bequeathed to me. You can have a beautiful wedding without wearing my inheritance." My father, Robert, chose that moment to intervene, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when he wanted to end discussions that made him uncomfortable. "Isabella, we've already decided that the rings should go to Chloe. She's getting married first, and she's the daughter who actually appreciates family values. You've had those rings locked away for 12 years without using them. That's selfish and wasteful." The recharacterization of my careful preservation of family treasures as selfish and wasteful was both morally wrong and legally ignorant. My father was treating museum-quality conservation as hoarding, while treating theft as generosity, completely reversing the ethical and legal realities of the situation. "Dad, those rings weren't locked away," I corrected, pulling out copies of my grandmother's will and the legal documents that established my ownership. "They were being preserved in proper conditions as specified in grandmother's will. I am the legal owner of those rings, and you had no authority to give them to anyone else. Don't lecture us about legal authority," my mother Margaret interjected, her voice becoming more aggressive as she realized I was prepared for a serious legal discussion, rather than simply accepting their decision and moving on. "We are the parents in this family, and we decide how family property should be distributed. You're not married, you don't have children, and you don't need expensive rings just to look at them." The legal ignorance in her statement was staggering. My parents were claiming parental authority over property that had been legally bequeathed to me by my grandmother's will, and they were treating my single status as grounds for violating my inheritance rights. They had no understanding of how estate law actually works, or what their actions legally represented. "Mom, being unmarried doesn't disqualify me from owning my inheritance," I explained, showing her the relevant sections of my grandmother's will. "These rings were specifically left to me regardless of my marital status or life choices. Grandmother's will is legally binding, and you violated it when you gave away my property." Chloe was becoming increasingly agitated by the legal discussion, clearly wanting to focus on her wedding plans rather than addressing the property rights issues surrounding the rings she was wearing. "Isabella, why are you trying to ruin my engagement?" she demanded, her voice rising with indignation. "These rings are perfect for my wedding, and I look beautiful in them. Can't you just be supportive of your sister for once?" The attempt to reframe property theft as family support was manipulative and legally meaningless, but it was also typical of how my family approached conflicts. by making the victim responsible for solving problems created by other people's bad behavior. Chloe, I'm not trying to ruin your engagement, I said, trying one more time to help her understand the legal reality of the situation. I'm trying to recover stolen property that was willed to me by our grandmother. You can have a beautiful wedding with rings that actually belong to you. These rings do belong to me now, Chloe replied, her voice becoming defiant as she twisted the Victorian ring on her finger. Mom and Dad gave them to me because I'm the daughter who's actually getting married and starting a family. You had your chance to use these rings, and you chose your career instead. The legal and logical errors in her statement were numerous, but the most significant was her complete misunderstanding of how inheritance works. Property that is willed to a specific person doesn't become available for redistribution just because the original beneficiary makes life choices that other family members disapprove of. My father decided to end the discussion with what he clearly thought was a definitive statement of family hierarchy and decision-making authority. Isabella, we've made our decision, and it's final. Chloe is getting married. She deserves beautiful rings, and these rings will be used properly instead of sitting in a safe. You need to accept this and stop trying to destroy your sister's happiness. Dad, this isn't about Chloe's happiness, I replied, gathering up my legal documents and preparing to leave before the conversation became even more hostile. This is about respecting grandmother's wishes and following the law. These rings were stolen from me, and I will be taking appropriate legal action to recover my property. The mention of legal action caused immediate panic among my family members, who clearly hadn't considered that their theft might have actual legal consequences beyond family drama and hurt feelings. Legal action? My mother asked, her voice rising with alarm. Isabella, you can't take your own family to court over some old jewelry. That would destroy our family relationships forever. Mom, you already destroyed our family relationships when you stole my inheritance, I replied, finally allowing my anger to show through the professional composure I had been maintaining. I tried to resolve this reasonably by explaining the legal problems with what you did. But you've made it clear that you don't respect my rights or grandmother's wishes. The conversation ended with my parents and Chloe becoming increasingly hostile about my threats and unreasonable demands, while I realized that legal action wasn't just my best option for recovering the rings, it was my only option for dealing with family members who had no respect for law, inheritance rights, or basic ethical behavior. As I drove home that evening, I knew that the family relationships we had once shared were over permanently, but I also knew that my legal expertise and careful documentation of the ring collection would ensure that justice was served regardless of my family's ignorance about inheritance law. The rings they had stolen so casually were about to become the center of a legal battle that would teach them exactly what theft of valuable property actually costs. Have you ever tried to reason with family members who were so convinced of their moral superiority that they couldn't see their own criminal behavior? That's exactly what I experienced, but it was also exactly what would make their legal education so comprehensive and expensive. The most devastating aspect of my family's theft wasn't just the loss of my inheritance, but the public humiliation of watching Chloe display the stolen rings at her elaborate engagement party, while guests complimented her on inheriting such beautiful family heirlooms. The party, which I learned about through social media posts since I hadn't been invited, was a celebration of my family's crime, disguised as a celebration of Chloe's love, and it provided crucial evidence for the legal case I was building against them. Chloe's engagement party was held at the Riverside Country Club, an upscale venue that reflected both her desire for an elegant celebration and her complete ignorance about the legal implications of wearing stolen property in public. The guest list included approximately 150 people, extended family members, family friends, Chloe's college friends, and David's professional colleagues, all of whom would serve as witnesses to her knowing possession of valuable property that didn't belong to her. I first learned about the party through Instagram posts from my cousin Sarah, who had shared photos of the elegant venue and the beautifully decorated tables, without realizing that she was documenting evidence of a crime in progress. The hashtags Ars Chloe's engagement and Ars Scott family rings created a digital trail that would prove invaluable in establishing the timeline and public nature of the theft. But it was Chloe's own social media posts that provided the most damaging evidence against her. Throughout the evening, she had posted dozens of photos showcasing different rings from our family collection, wearing them as coordinating accessories with different outfits, and treating centuries of Scott family heritage like a personal jewelry box that existed for her entertainment. Wearing great-great-grandmother Victoria's ring tonight, Chloe had captioned a photo of herself displaying the $150,000 Victorian masterpiece while posing with her fiancé David. So grateful to have such stunning family history to share on our special night. Blessed my family legacy, our vintage rings, our engagement party. The casual way she was treating our great-great-grandmother's irreplaceable ring as a photo prop was heartbreaking, but it was also legally significant evidence that she knew the rings represented valuable family history while choosing to treat them as personal property, rather than questioning how she had suddenly gained access to heirlooms that had been under my guardianship for over a decade. Another post showed Chloe wearing my great-grandmother Eleanor's Art Deco ring while cutting the engagement cake. Eleanor's 1923 Art Deco ring is absolutely perfect for tonight's celebration. I feel so connected to all the strong Scot women who wore these rings before me. Can't wait to add my own story to this beautiful legacy. Art Deco, family tradition, Spanish engagement rings, girls' night. The irony of Chloe claiming to feel connected to strong Scot women while stealing from the Scot woman who had been entrusted with preserving their legacy was both infuriating and legally useful. Her post demonstrated clear knowledge that the rings represented family history and tradition, which would make it impossible for her to claim ignorance about their significance or ownership when the legal case proceeded. But the most damaging evidence came from posts where Chloe explicitly discussed the rings' value and significance while treating them as her personal property, trying on all the family rings to decide which ones to wear for different wedding events. She had posted alongside a photo showing her wearing multiple rings simultaneously. Each one tells a different love story. I'm so lucky to have inherited such beautiful pieces. The Victorian one is worth more than most people's cars. Wedding planning, family, jewels, inherited. Lucky girl. The casual mention of the ring's monetary value proved that Chloe understood she was wearing extremely valuable property, while her claim to have inherited them was false and legally problematic. She hadn't inherited anything. She had received stolen goods from my parents, who had no legal authority to redistribute my inheritance. Extended family members who attended the party had also posted photos and comments that would serve as witness testimony about Chloe's public display of the stolen rings. My Aunt Linda had shared a photo of herself with Chloe, captioning it, "So proud of Chloe for finally bringing the Scott family rings out of storage. They're even more beautiful than I remembered, and they look perfect on her. Isabella kept them locked away for so long. It's wonderful to see them being used for their intended purpose." The family narrative that I had been hoarding the rings, rather than properly preserving them, was both factually wrong and legally irrelevant, but it demonstrated that my extended family had been influenced by my parents' false characterization of my guardianship as selfishness, rather than responsibility. My cousin James had posted, "Amazing engagement party for Chloe. Those family rings are incredible. Each one must be worth a fortune. Great to see them being worn by someone who appreciates family history and tradition. Chloe will take wonderful care of these heirlooms." The repeated references to the ring's value and historical significance would make it impossible for anyone involved to claim they didn't understand the seriousness of what had been stolen or the legal implications of receiving and displaying valuable stolen property. But perhaps the most damaging evidence came from my parents' own social media posts during the party, where they took credit for finally making the rings available while explicitly acknowledging that they had taken them from me without permission. My father Robert had posted, "So proud of our daughter Chloe tonight. We finally decided to give her the Scott family ring since she's the daughter who's actually getting married. These rings deserve to be worn by someone who values love and family commitment. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions about family traditions." The casual admission that they had finally decided to give away my inheritance while justifying theft based on their disapproval of my life choices was legally devastating. Robert was essentially confessing to inheritance fraud while treating their crime as wise family leadership. My mother Margaret had posted similar content. "Beautiful engagement party for Chloe. The Scott family rings look absolutely perfect on her. Much better than sitting in storage unused. We knew these rings needed to go to the daughter who would actually appreciate them and use them properly. So happy to see family treasures being celebrated." The posts from my parents provided clear evidence that they had knowingly taken valuable property that belonged to me and given it to Chloe, while justifying their theft based on their personal opinions about my life choices and their preferences for which daughter should benefit from family heirlooms. But the social media documentation wasn't just evidence of theft. It was also evidence of the emotional distress and public humiliation that my family's crime had caused me. Watching dozens of family members and friends celebrate Chloe's inheritance of rings that had been stolen from me was devastating, but it was also grounds for significant damages in the civil case I was preparing to file. As I scrolled through hundreds of photos and comments about Chloe's beautiful family rings and her luck in inheriting such valuable pieces, I realized that my family's theft had been compounded by their public lies about how Chloe had gained access to the collection. They had allowed guests to believe that Chloe was the legitimate heir to these rings, destroying my reputation as the actual guardian while building a false narrative about her inheritance rights. The engagement party had been intended to celebrate Chloe's upcoming marriage, but it had actually become a public documentation of multiple crimes, including inheritance theft, receiving stolen goods, and fraud. Every photo, every post, and every comment would serve as evidence in the comprehensive legal case that would soon teach my family exactly what their theft of family heirlooms would cost them. Have you ever watched your family celebrate someone else's theft of your inheritance while treating you like the villain for objecting to being robbed? That's exactly what I experienced, but it was also exactly what would make the eventual legal justice so complete and satisfying. While my family celebrated their theft of my inheritance and treated Chloe's public display of stolen property as a heartwarming family tradition, I was quietly working with specialized legal experts who understood both the value of what had been taken from me and the serious legal consequences that my family would face for inheritance fraud and theft of valuable cultural property. My expertise as a contract attorney had connected me to estate law specialists and property recovery experts who regularly handled cases involving family members who stole valuable collections while assuming that family relationships would protect them from legal accountability. My first consultation was with Patricia Hamilton, a partner at Hamilton & Associates who specialized in estate litigation and inheritance disputes. Patricia's practice focused on recovering stolen inheritances and protecting beneficiaries from family members who violated wills and estate plans. She had extensive experience with cases involving valuable collections, family heirlooms, and relatives who redistributed inherited property based on personal preferences rather than legal authority. Ms. Scott, Patricia said as we reviewed the documentation I had brought to our initial meeting, what your parents did constitutes clear inheritance fraud under state law, and the value of your ring collection puts this case into categories that carry both criminal penalties and significant civil damages. Your grandmother's will is extremely clear about her intentions, and your parents had no legal authority to redistribute your inheritance. The legal reality that my family faced was far more serious than anything they had considered when they dismissed my objections as selfishness about material possessions. Inheritance fraud involving property valued over $100,000 triggered mandatory reporting requirements and potential criminal prosecution, while the civil damages could include treble damages and attorney's fees that would make their theft exponentially more expensive than the original value of what they had stolen. Patricia explained that my meticulous documentation of the ring collection, including professional appraisals, insurance records, provenance documentation, and photographs tracking their condition over time, provided exceptional evidence for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery. Most inheritance fraud cases struggled with proving ownership and value, but my 12 years of careful record-keeping had created an ironclad case that would be nearly impossible for my family to defend against. Your documentation is extraordinary, Patricia noted as she examined my detailed inventory records and historical research. Most people don't maintain this level of detail about family heirlooms, which makes prosecution difficult. But you have clear ownership records, expert valuations, and comprehensive documentation that establishes not just what was taken, but also its historical and monetary significance. The professional appraisals I had obtained over the years would be crucial in establishing the felony-level value of what had been stolen. The Victorian ring alone was worth $150,000, while the complete collection had been appraised at $550,000 by experts in vintage jewelry. These values put the theft into categories that carried mandatory minimum sentences and significant civil penalties. But Patricia also explained that my case involved more than just simple theft. It involved the deliberate violation of a legally binding will and the fraudulent redistribution of inherited property based on personal preferences rather than legal authority. This elevated the case from basic property theft to inheritance fraud, which carried additional criminal penalties and civil remedies. Your parents didn't just steal valuable property, Patricia clarified. They committed inheritance fraud by deliberately violating your grandmother's will and redistributing legally bequeathed property based on their personal opinions about your life choices. This is a serious crime that prosecutors take very seriously because it undermines the entire legal framework of estate planning and inheritance. While Patricia prepared the criminal referral and civil lawsuit, I also worked with Michael Chen, a private investigator who specialized in tracking stolen cultural property and documenting the movement and display of valuable collections. Michael's expertise would be crucial in establishing the chain of custody of my rings and documenting how they were being used after the theft. Your family was remarkably careless in their handling of stolen property, Michael observed after reviewing the extensive social media evidence from Chloe's engagement party. They not only publicly displayed the rings, but they created a comprehensive digital record of their theft, possession, and public claims of ownership. This level of documentation is unusual and extremely helpful for prosecution. Michael's investigation revealed that Chloe had not only worn the rings publicly, but had also taken them to jewelers for cleaning and resizing, creating additional witness testimony about her possession of valuable property that she claimed to have inherited, despite being unable to provide any legal documentation of her ownership rights. Several jewelers have confirmed that your sister brought in multiple expensive rings for services, Michael reported. When asked about the rings' history and ownership, she claimed they were family heirlooms that had been passed down to her because she was getting married. None of the jewelers questioned her ownership, but they all documented the work performed and the ring's exceptional value. But Michael's investigation also uncovered evidence that made my family's situation much worse than simple inheritance fraud. Bank records showed that my parents had used some of the rings as collateral for loans, essentially treating my inherited property as their personal assets that could be leveraged for their own financial benefit. Your parents took out a $50,000 loan using the Victorian ring as collateral, Michael explained, as we reviewed financial documents he had obtained through legal discovery. This creates additional charges related to fraudulent use of stolen property, and potentially federal charges if the lender was federally insured. The evidence that my parents had not only given away my inheritance, but had also used it as loan collateral, demonstrated that their theft was systematic and ongoing, rather than a single bad decision about family property distribution. They had been treating my legally inherited rings as their personal assets for months, while I remained unaware of their crime. Working with Patricia's legal team, I also consulted with Dr. Amanda Foster, an expert witness who specialized in the valuation and cultural significance of vintage jewelry collections. Dr. Foster's expertise would be crucial in educating juries and judges about why these rings represented more than just expensive jewelry. They were cultural artifacts that documented the evolution of American jewelry design and family traditions over more than a century. Your collection is museum quality, Dr. Foster explained during our consultation. These rings represent not just monetary value, but also historical and cultural significance that makes them irreplaceable. The Victorian ring, in particular, is an exceptional example of 19th century craftsmanship that would be appropriate for display in major museums. Dr. Foster's expert testimony would help establish that my family's theft had caused damages far beyond the ring's monetary value. They had destroyed a culturally significant collection that had been preserved for generations, and they had done so for purely personal reasons, rather than any legitimate purpose. The legal team also identified additional civil remedies that would ensure my family faced comprehensive consequences for their theft and fraud. Beyond recovering the rings themselves, I would be entitled to punitive damages, attorney's fees, costs for investigation and recovery, and damages for emotional distress caused by their betrayal and public humiliation. We're seeking total damages of approximately $8 million in the civil case, Patricia explained, which includes the value of your collection plus consequential damages, punitive damages for the malicious nature of the theft, emotional distress damages, and full attorney's fees for recovery costs. The comprehensive legal strategy would ensure that my family faced both criminal prosecution and civil consequences that would affect them financially for the rest of their lives. Even if they eventually returned the rings, they would be responsible for damages that far exceeded the original theft amount. But the most satisfying aspect of the legal preparation was that it would unfold publicly during one of Chloe's wedding celebrations, where she would be surrounded by the same guests who had admired her inherited rings during the engagement party. Patricia and the prosecutor's office had coordinated to serve criminal and civil papers during Chloe's bridal shower, where she was planning to display the complete ring collection to her wedding party. Public service of papers during the bridal shower will maximize the educational impact, Patricia explained. Your family needs to understand that inheritance fraud has serious consequences, and the broader community needs to see that stealing family heirlooms results in criminal prosecution and civil liability. The bridal shower that was supposed to be Chloe's final celebration before her wedding was about to become the scene of her arrest for receiving stolen property and conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud. The rings she had been displaying as symbols of her blessed inheritance were about to become evidence in a criminal case that would destroy her engagement, her reputation, and her financial future. Have you ever prepared a legal response so comprehensive that it would educate not just the criminals who wronged you, but also everyone who witnessed and celebrated their crimes? That's exactly what I was doing as my legal team prepared to serve justice during my sister's bridal shower, transforming her celebration of theft into her education about accountability. The coordination between prosecutors, civil attorneys, and law enforcement reached its dramatic climax on the afternoon of Chloe's bridal shower, an event that had been planned as her final celebration before the wedding and her last opportunity to show off the complete stolen ring collection to her closest friends and wedding party members. The irony of choosing a bridal shower to display stolen engagement rings was about to become devastatingly clear to everyone involved. The bridal shower was held at the elegant garden room of the Fairmont Hotel, with approximately 40 guests including Chloe's bridesmaids, college friends, family members, and David's female relatives who had traveled to town for the wedding festivities. The venue had been decorated in Chloe's chosen wedding colors, and the centerpiece of the celebration was a special display case where Chloe had arranged all 5 stolen rings for guests to admire and photograph. I learned about the detailed arrangements through my cousin Sarah, who remained unaware of the legal proceedings that were about to unfold. Chloe has created this beautiful display of all the Scott family rings, Sarah had texted me the night before. She's so excited to show them off to her bridesmaids and tell the story of each ring. It's like a museum exhibit of our family history. The characterization of my stolen inheritance as a museum exhibit was both accurate and ironic, since museum-quality artifacts had indeed been stolen and were being displayed by someone who had no legal right to possess them. But Sarah's innocent description also confirmed that Chloe was planning to publicly display all of the stolen rings simultaneously, providing perfect conditions for law enforcement to recover the complete collection at once. At 2:30 p.m., just as the bridal shower was reaching its peak with Chloe giving detailed presentations about each ring's history and significance, 4 unmarked police vehicles arrived at the Fairmont Hotel. Detective Maria Rodriguez, who specialized in art and property theft, led a team of officers who were prepared to execute arrest warrants for Chloe and my parents, along with search warrants to recover the stolen ring collection. Patricia Hamilton accompanied the law enforcement team, carrying civil papers that would be served simultaneously with the criminal charges. The coordination ensured that my family would face both criminal prosecution and civil liability at the same moment, demonstrating the comprehensive nature of legal accountability for inheritance fraud. I waited in the hotel lobby as the legal team proceeded to the garden room, knowing that the next few minutes would permanently change my family's understanding of the consequences for theft and their celebration of criminal behavior. The bridal shower that was supposed to celebrate Chloe's upcoming marriage was about to become a demonstration of how law enforcement handles inheritance fraud and theft of valuable cultural property. The garden room fell silent when Detective Rodriguez and her team entered with their badges displayed and legal documents in hand. Chloe was standing beside her display case of stolen rings, mid-sentence in explaining the family tradition of passing down engagement rings, when she realized that law enforcement officers were approaching her with arrest warrants. "Chloe Scott," Detective Rodriguez announced clearly enough for all 40 guests to hear, "you are under arrest for receiving stolen property, conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud, and possession of stolen goods valued at over $500,000. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The formal reading of felony charges caused immediate chaos among the bridal shower guests, who were now witnessing the arrest of the bride-to-be for serious property crimes involving the very rings they had been admiring moments earlier. The beautiful family tradition they had been celebrating was revealed to be organized criminal activity involving multiple family members. Chloe's response to being handcuffed was exactly what I had expected based on her character. She immediately tried to blame me for her legal problems while denying any knowledge of wrongdoing. "This is insane," she screamed as officers secured her hands behind her back. "These are my family rings! My parents gave them to me! Isabella is just jealous that I'm getting married and she's still single. Ma'am, Detective Rodriguez replied professionally, these rings were legally inherited by Isabella Scott under her grandmother's will. Your parents had no legal authority to redistribute inherited property, and you have been in possession of stolen goods valued at over $500,000. The professional correction of Chloe's attempts to minimize the seriousness of her crimes provided clear education for the bridal shower guests about the actual legal status of what they had been celebrating. These weren't family gifts or legitimate inheritance transfers. They were felony-level thefts that carried significant criminal penalties. The arrest of the bride-to-be was only the beginning of the legal proceedings that would unfold at the bridal shower. Other officers were simultaneously arresting my parents, who had been invited to the shower, and were present to witness Chloe's display of the stolen rings. Margaret and Robert Scott were handcuffed and read their rights in front of the same guests who had praised their generous decision to give Chloe such beautiful family heirlooms. Margaret Scott and Robert Scott, another officer announced, you are under arrest for inheritance fraud, theft of property valued at over $500,000, and conspiracy to violate a state law. You have the right to remain silent. The sight of both parents being arrested simultaneously while guests watched in shock was devastating for Chloe. But it was also educational for everyone present about the seriousness of inheritance fraud and the legal consequences that await family members who steal from designated beneficiaries. My mother's reaction was to immediately blame me for the family's legal crisis, just as she had blamed me for not simply accepting their theft and moving on with my life. Danielle is destroying our family over some old jewelry, Margaret shouted as she was led away in handcuffs. She's having her own parents arrested because she's bitter about being single. Detective Rodriguez's response was professionally devastating. Ma'am, your daughter is having you arrested because you committed felony theft of her legally inherited property. Your family relationship doesn't provide immunity from criminal prosecution for serious property crimes. The law enforcement officer's correction of my mother's attempt to reframe inheritance fraud as family drama provided clear education for the witnesses about the actual legal nature of what had occurred. This wasn't about family jealousy or wedding traditions. It was about serious crimes that carry mandatory prison sentences, but the arrests were only part of the legal consequences that were unfolding at the bridal shower. Patricia Hamilton was simultaneously serving civil papers that would ensure my family faced financial liability far beyond the value of what they had stolen. Chloe Scott, Patricia announced as she served the civil complaint, you are being sued for $1.8 million in damages for receiving stolen property, conversion, and conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud. This lawsuit will proceed regardless of the outcome of your criminal prosecution. The revelation that the civil damages exceeded the value of the stolen rings by more than 3 times was shocking to the bridal shower guests, who were learning that property crimes involve not just returning stolen items, but also paying significant penalties for the harm caused to victims. The search warrant execution also revealed additional evidence of my family's crimes, including documentation showing that they had researched the rings' values before stealing them, and had consulted with jewelers about insurance and resale options. This evidence proved that their theft was premeditated and systematic, rather than an impulsive family decision about property distribution. We have evidence that the defendants researched the monetary value of the victim's ring collection before taking it, Detective Rodriguez announced to the assembled guests. This was not a family misunderstanding about property ownership. This was calculated theft of extremely valuable inherited property. The recovery of the stolen rings was accomplished systematically, with each piece being photographed in Chloe's possession before being secured as evidence. The Victorian ring was removed from Chloe's finger while she was being processed for arrest, and the other rings were collected from the display case where she had been showing them off to her wedding party. Have you ever watched criminals get arrested for crimes they were actively celebrating? That's exactly what happened as my family was taken into custody while surrounded by evidence of their theft, and the guests who had been admiring their stolen property. The bridal shower that was supposed to be Chloe's final celebration before her wedding had become a public demonstration of law enforcement's commitment to prosecuting inheritance fraud and protecting the legal rights of inheritance beneficiaries. The guests who had praised the beautiful family rings were now witnesses to arrests for serious felonies that would result in prison sentences and permanent criminal records. But the arrests were only the beginning of the comprehensive legal process that would ultimately restore justice and teach my family exactly what their theft of family heirlooms would cost them for the rest of their lives. The months following the dramatic arrests at Chloe's bridal shower unfolded with a precision and completeness that exceeded even my highest expectations for justice and legal accountability. The criminal prosecution proceeded swiftly through the courts, with overwhelming evidence that made any defense strategy impossible, while the civil lawsuit resulted in a comprehensive judgment that ensured my family would face financial consequences for their inheritance fraud for decades to come. The criminal case against my parents and Chloe attracted significant media attention because of the unusual circumstances involving a bridal shower arrest and the high value of the stolen ring collection. Family arrested for stealing $550,000 inheritance at bridal shower was the headline that appeared in our local newspaper, along with detailed coverage of the inheritance fraud case and its implications for estate law. The evidence against my family was overwhelming and undeniable. The social media posts from Chloe's engagement party provided clear documentation of their knowing possession of stolen property, while bank records showed that my parents had used the rings as loan collateral, proving systematic rather than impulsive theft. Most damaging were the recorded conversations where they had admitted to taking my rings without permission, while justifying their theft based on disapproval of my life choices. The defendant's own statements and social media posts provide unambiguous evidence of deliberate theft and conspiracy. Prosecutor James Wilson explained during a press conference about the case. This prosecution demonstrates that inheritance fraud carries serious consequences regardless of family relationships, and that valuable cultural property deserves the full protection of the law. The criminal trial lasted only 4 days, with guilty verdicts on all charges following less than 3 hours of jury deliberation. The evidence was so comprehensive that my family's attorneys advised them to accept plea bargains rather than proceed to trial, but they had refused to acknowledge the seriousness of their crimes until confronted with the certainty of conviction. Chloe was convicted of receiving stolen property, conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud, and possession of stolen goods valued at over $500,000. Her sentence included 3 years in state prison, 5 years of supervised probation, and full restitution of damages determined by the civil lawsuit. Her criminal conviction also resulted in the cancellation of her wedding, as David ended their engagement after learning the full scope of her criminal activity. Margaret and Robert Scott were convicted of inheritance fraud, theft of property valued at over $500,000, conspiracy, and fraudulent use of stolen property as loan collateral. Their sentences included 5 years in state prison each, followed by 7 years of supervised probation, during which their finances would be monitored to ensure restitution payments continued. But the criminal convictions were only part of the comprehensive justice delivered by the legal system. The civil lawsuit resulted in a judgment that far exceeded the original value of my stolen ring collection, reflecting not just monetary damages, but also punitive damages for the malicious nature of their theft and the emotional distress caused by their betrayal and public humiliation. The civil jury awarded total damages of $2.1 million, Patricia Hamilton informed me after the verdict was announced. This includes the value of your ring collection, consequential damages for the irreplaceable nature of the stolen items, punitive damages for the defendant's malicious conduct, emotional distress damages, and complete attorney's fees for the recovery process. The $1 million civil judgment would follow my family for the rest of their lives, with wage garnishment and asset seizure ensuring that they remained financially responsible for their crimes long after completing their prison sentences. Their homeowners' insurance policies excluded coverage for intentional criminal acts, meaning they would be personally liable for the full amount. The asset forfeiture process also revealed the extent to which my parents had been living beyond their means while stealing from my inheritance. Their house, vehicles, and personal property were seized and sold to provide partial restitution, but the remaining judgment would require decades of payments that would permanently affect their financial futures. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the legal resolution was the complete restoration of my ring collection, along with additional rings that had been discovered during the investigation. The Victorian ring was returned in perfect condition, having been recovered before Chloe could cause any damage through improper handling or storage. All 5 rings were professionally cleaned and reappraised, with their values having increased during the period they were stolen. The recovery process also revealed additional family jewelry that I hadn't known existed. During the search of my parents' house, investigators discovered a jewelry box containing several rings and necklaces that had belonged to other Scott family members, but had never been properly inventoried or included in estate documents. These items were also restored to me as the legitimate heir to Scott family property. Your grandmother apparently had additional jewelry that was never formally documented, Patricia explained as we reviewed the complete inventory of recovered items. The total value of recovered property exceeds $650,000, which increases both the criminal penalties and civil damages your family faces. The discovery of additional stolen property also resulted in enhanced charges against my parents, demonstrating that their theft of family heirlooms had been even more systematic and comprehensive than originally known. They had been taking Scott family jewelry for years, while I remained unaware of the extent of their crimes. But the most satisfying outcome of the legal proceedings was the restoration of truth about Scott family history and traditions. The false narrative that my parents had created about my hoarding of family rings was replaced by accurate information about my role as the designated guardian of culturally significant artifacts that deserved professional preservation and care. The expert testimony from Dr. Amanda Foster had educated the jury about the historical and cultural importance of my ring collection, helping them understand that these weren't just expensive jewelry pieces, but also cultural artifacts that documented the evolution of American jewelry design and family traditions over more than 150 years. Ms. Scott's collection represents museum-quality examples of jewelry from different historical periods, Dr. Foster testified. Her careful preservation of these rings has maintained their cultural and historical significance, while the defendant's theft threatened to destroy artifacts that benefit researchers, collectors, and future generations. With my ring collection restored and my legal rights vindicated, I was able to proceed with plans that honored both my grandmother's intentions and the historical significance of these precious family heirlooms. Working with the Smithsonian Institution's Jewelry and Decorative Arts Department, I arranged to loan several rings for a traveling exhibition about American engagement ring traditions and family heirloom preservation. The Scott family ring collection represents an exceptional example of how families can preserve cultural history through careful stewardship of inherited artifacts, the exhibition curator wrote in the museum catalog. These rings document not just personal love stories, but also the evolution of American jewelry design, craftsmanship, and cultural traditions across 5 generations. The museum exhibition provided a meaningful way to share the ring's beauty and historical significance with the public while maintaining their preservation for future generations. Seeing thousands of people appreciate and learn from these family treasures was more satisfying than any private ownership could have been. I also established the Scott Family Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provides education and resources for families who want to preserve valuable heirlooms and cultural artifacts. The foundation offers grants for professional conservation, legal assistance for inheritance disputes, and educational programs about the importance of cultural preservation. Isabella Scott's experience with inheritance fraud and her successful recovery of stolen family heirlooms has created important precedents for protecting cultural property, said Professor Michael Davidson from the university's estate law program. Her foundation is helping other families avoid similar theft while providing resources for legitimate heirs who need legal assistance. 5 years after my family's conviction for inheritance fraud, I continue to serve as guardian of the restored Scott family ring collection, but now with additional legal protections and professional conservation support that ensure these treasures will be preserved for centuries to come. My parents and Chloe are serving their prison sentences while making restitution payments that will continue for decades after their release. The ring collection that they tried to steal and destroy has become more valuable and culturally significant than ever before, displayed in museums, documented in academic publications, and protected by legal precedents that strengthen inheritance rights for future generations of cultural property guardians. Margaret Robert and Chloe Scott learned that inheritance fraud isn't just a family disagreement about property distribution. It's a serious crime that carries lasting consequences for both freedom and financial security. Their attempt to punish me for my life choices by stealing my inheritance instead became their education about legal accountability and the true cost of betraying family trust. But perhaps the most important lesson from their crimes and conviction is that family legacy belongs to its rightful heirs regardless of personal disapproval or social pressure about marriage timing. Cultural heritage can't be redistributed based on who gets engaged first or who conforms to family expectations about life choices. The rings that were stolen from me because I was too focused on career instead of marriage are now part of prestigious museum exhibitions that educate thousands of people about American cultural history. The woman who was dismissed as a bitter spinster, who didn't deserve beautiful engagement rings, has become a recognized expert in cultural preservation, whose work protects inherited property for families across the country. If you're dealing with family members who feel entitled to redistribute your inherited property based on their personal opinions about your life choices, please know that the law exists to protect legitimate heirs, regardless of family politics or social expectations. Inheritance rights aren't conditional on marriage status, family approval, or conformity to other people's timelines and preferences. Document your inherited property carefully. Understand your legal rights as a beneficiary, and don't hesitate to pursue legal remedies when family members violate estate law or steal inherited assets. Cultural property and family heirlooms deserve protection not just for individual owners, but for the broader community that benefits from preservation of historical artifacts and family traditions. Have you ever had family members try to steal or redistribute your inheritance because they disapproved of your life choices? How do you protect valuable family heirlooms from relatives who might not understand or respect their significance? Your experience might help someone else who's dealing with similar threats to their inherited property and family legacy. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Remember that your inherited property and family legacy are worth protecting from anyone who would steal them, even if those people are relatives who claim to know what's best for family traditions. Sometimes the greatest revenge against inheritance fraud is ensuring that stolen property is not only recovered, but also preserved and celebrated in ways that honor the original intentions of those who created the legacy. See you in our next story here on Her Sweet Revenge.